So good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to 360 Energy's webinar discussing generation and load displacement options for customers. It's my pleasure today to introduce James Williams, 360 Energy's energy analyst. Part of James and 360 Energy's work that we do for our as an energy consultant is to provide a non-biased analysis and review of proposed installation of generators, batteries, and load displacement technologies in general that our customers are considering. As I'm sure many people online today have experienced, there are many options available to potentially meet their goals. And the options and some of the details contained in the agreements for these technologies can be a bit difficult to understand, compare, and ultimately determine which option and which contract would be best for them. So in today's presentation, we're going to outline some of the pros and cons of the main solutions that are out there that are proposed to customers, how well these solutions work given different goals and requirements for electrical load displacement, as well as some things to be mindful of in general when considering purchasing or entering into these agreements. We do still recommend doing an independent review of all the options you're considering if you're looking at one of these solutions, just as a double check when considering one of these options, as every customer, as you can imagine, has unique operating requirements that do need to be considered when determining which solution is best in a given circumstance. Before we get started with today's presentation, just wanted to mention really quickly that we're also going to be hosting a breakfast event on May the 3rd at the Holiday Inn in Burlington with our partner, the Canadian Energy Research Institute, or also known as CERI. Related to today's topic, Alan Fogwell, the President and CEO of CERI, will be discussing energy storage in Canada, a bit about its research and development and how it can and ultimately will assist provinces and customers in meeting their energy goals. We'll be sending out a meeting invitation to everyone here for this event, so please just keep an eye out for that later today. Just a couple more notes before we get started. We will be recording this presentation today, and it will be made available on our website today as well. We'll make sure you get a copy of the link to view the presentation again if you do want to kind of review what's been gone through today. We'll also have an opportunity for questions at the end of today's presentation. We will have our lines muted just to cut down on noise during the presentation, but we do recommend writing down your questions in the chat function of the webinar, and we'll do our best to get to get as many of these questions at least as possible answered at the end. Following the webinar, we're also just going to send out a quick survey to everybody just so you can give us a bit of feedback on how today's presentation went and just to kind of get some input for us to potentially get better next time as well. So that's it for me in any case. So without any further ado, I'll hand this off to James to get started with today's webinar. Thanks.
Thank you, Julie, and thank you to all of you for attending. So to start off, we'll give you a quick rundown of the generation types that we'll be talking about for the rest of the presentation. So this is what is distributed generation. So the ones we'll be looking at are fuel cells. And a fuel cell is a generator that uses a chemical reaction on a continuous fuel source to produce electricity and sometimes useful heat from hydrogen and oxygen. The fuel can be either natural gas or hydrogen. If it's natural gas, it's broken apart so that the hydrogen in the natural gas can be used for the fuel cell part. And it generally has a continuous operating profile. It's generally operating on the scale of 4,000 to 8,000 plus hours over the course of a year. A cogen, or a gas engine CHP, has a similar operating profile, also uses natural gas as a fuel. It also provides electricity and useful heat, but it does so through the use of combustion rather than a chemical reaction. A standby generator is very similar to a cogen with a recovery part. So it's just a generator that uses combustion on a fuel source, typically either natural gas or diesel, to provide power. And most standby generators, as their name kind of implies, operate on a very controllable profile. So rather than operating pretty much continuously, they operate during specific hours, either when needed as backup or when optimizing costs. And a battery storage is not technically generation, but it does qualify under the broader term of distributed energy resource. It takes in electricity from a source, stores it through a chemical process, reverses the chemical process to provide electricity when needed. So again, its fuel is electricity, typically coming from the electricity grid. And most batteries operate similar to standby generators in that they're charging at certain periods, discharging at certain periods, typically when needed, either for on-site generation or issues or for cost optimization. So we'll move now to a poll. Wait 1 second while I get that lined up. So you should be getting a poll now asking if you've received or if you've been approached by generators or suppliers for one of these generation options. So just take a moment to vote. So the reason we're asking this question is in part because we have been approached by customers to provide input into all of these options, and our customers are approaching us because suppliers are approaching them, and they don't know how to choose between the different generation options. So we'll just close the poll now and share it so that you can see what the were. And again, similar to our customers, about 75% of you online have been approached about these kinds of distribution options. That's not a surprise to us, again, based on our own experience. And we'll look now at the reason why suppliers are really starting to approach customers about distributed energy resources. The big reason is really the global adjustment. There's easy cost savings associated with on-site generation, especially in Ontario at the current moment. So this chart shows that you can see the change in Class A savings or costs over the course of the past 6 years, and of course the change in global adjustment costs for Class B customers over the past 6 years. So the chart on the top is for Class A customers, and you can see that the average cost for a Class A customer based on 1 megawatt over the 5 coincident peaks was around $250,000 a year in 2013-2014. That increased to about $350,000 in 2014-2015, and up to a high of about $550,000, almost $600,000 in 2015-2016, before flattening out over the next couple of years. For Class B customers, the same kind of thing happened. Prices effectively doubled from about $50 to $55 per megawatt hour in 2013-2014 to a high of $100 per megawatt hour in 2017-2018. So global adjustment costs over the past 6 years have doubled, and they did so in a very short period of time. So that's one reason why we've seen more suppliers approaching customers. The other is that the Class A global adjustment, which has also known as the ICI, or Industrial Conservation Initiative, saw an expansion in the qualification criteria. So the qualification dropped from 5 megawatt threshold to a 3 megawatt threshold to a 1 megawatt threshold, which is where it is for many commercial or municipal customers in the province. but it also then dropped down to 500 kilowatts for manufacturing and greenhouse customers. So that change in rate from 5 megawatts down to, in some cases, 500 kilowatts saw an explosion of customers in the ICI program. So you had, on the one hand, an increased payback for global adjustment, and on the other, an increased customer base. And that has pulled a lot of customers into the orbit or the space of suppliers, energy service providers. And especially one of the growing areas for energy service providers is battery storage. They've been a big driver behind this transition to distributed energy resources. And a large part of that is the sharp drop in battery prices. So again, this is from Bloomberg NES, their 2018 new energy. And as you can see, battery prices dropped from about $1,000 per kilowatt hour in 2010, fell by about half through 2014, and they've fallen by more than half again since 2014. So about falling in half about every 4 years. And if you look at the future trend, that's continuing. So we've seen that batteries have fallen in cost, which makes them a lot more of an attractive option for suppliers to offer to customers. Given the increase in global adjustment costs, there's a much better payback associated with batteries now than there was, say, 2014, when batteries were twice the price and the global adjustment savings price. And battery providers have also been near the forefront of some different ways of paying for or contracting distributed energy, such as energy storage as a service agreement, and we'll look at those later on in the presentation as well. So again, the result has been an explosion of energy service providers offering very similar packages. So Energy Storage Canada alone, just battery providers, has 25 members offering energy storage solutions, and that's just their membership. There are more battery storage providers who, as far as we know, are not members of Energy Storage Canada. And our view is this is a good thing for customers because it means there's competition. You should have a lot of suppliers competing for your business for energy storage within the battery space and within the distributed energy resource space as a whole. So this ties back to global adjustment. So again, the first thing you need to know when you're looking at on-site generation is which class you are currently in and which classes you qualify for, because the different classes have very different cost structures, and that'll impact the payback. So this goes beyond batteries now. This is tying into the fuel cells or the cogens or the standby generators. When you're looking at any of these options, the first thing to know is how you're paying for your power, and a large part of that comes down to your rate class, whether you are Class A and Class B. And I'll just put a caveat in now that the provincial government is looking at electricity rates across the province. So there's for electricity rates to change in the future. They currently have an industrial consultation process open. So this is based on the information we have now regarding the current electricity rates. There is the potential for that to change in the future. But when we talk about electricity rates, we're basing it, since we don't have any other rate structures before us to consider, we're comparing Class A and Class B. So for Class A customers, the big thing is looking at really the global adjustment, because that's what it impacts and how you pay for it. So for the Class A customers, if you look at the top chart, their cost is $500,000 to $550,000 per year per megawatt of demand over the 5 coincident peaks. And so for Class A, if you don't know how it works, customers are billed based on their usage during the 5 highest demand hours from the Ontario grid, or also called the 5 coincident peaks. And so if you use 1 megawatt during each of those 5 peaks, you will pay $500,000 to $550,000 per megawatt. That ties back into the chart we were looking at before. For Class B customers, the payment is very different. They pay on a cost per kilowatt hour basis, and the cost is typically 8 to 10 cents. We have seen it get as high as 12 cents, as low as say 6 cents, but on average over the course of a year, the cost is 8 to 10 cents. And that fluctuates on a monthly basis. It's set on a monthly basis. So when you look at the total cost breakdown for a customer, $500,000 to $550,000 worth of their bill comes from the Class A, or from the 5 coincident peaks. So just 5 hours for a Class A customer is generating $500,000 to $550,000 worth of costs, assuming a 1 megawatt customer. The cost per kilowatt is limited to really the hourly market, or the HOEP, the HOEP, and that's a fairly small portion for a customer. That's 2 to 3.5 cents per kilowatt hour. Typically, for the Class A customer, we see a 65 to 75% of their costs come from the 5 coincident peaks, assuming they don't do anything specific to manage it, and about 20% of the costs come from the HOEP, or the cost per kilowatt hour. For Class B customer, they don't pay anything for the 5 coincident peaks, but they do pay a significantly higher cost per kilowatt hour, so that 11.5 to 12 cents per kilowatt hour compared to 2 to 3.5 cents per kilowatt hour. And the main thing here is that when you're looking at generation options, you need to know what your cost is when those generators are running. The point is, a cogen or a fuel cell, and we'll talk about this in a bit more detail, typically runs at a price that's around 5 to 7 cents per kilowatt hour. So if you're a Class A customer, most of the time that cogen's running, it's running at more than what you're paying for power from the grid otherwise, because you're only paying 2 to 3.5 cents. Where if you're a Class A customer or a Class B customer, and a standby generator is really going to optimize your cost for 5 hours, or even 100 hours, it's not going to get the same payback as it would for a Class A customer who has, 5 hours that are really, really expensive. So this is a bit of a comparison for the Class A, for the different generator types in terms of how they generate costs, or what the cost of the different generation types are. And it's meant to be more obviously each individual project will have its own specific costs. A fuel cell by one supplier might have different costs than a fuel cell offered by a different supplier. Just across the 4 types, how they generally compare to each other. So fuel cells and CHPs generally have higher upfront purchase costs because they have the heat recovery equipment that needs to tie into the system. And so that heat recovery equipment adds cost on top of the generation, on top of the generator, and that pushes the initial purchase price up. Now, we will also, again, be looking at options beyond just purchasing it, but that'll come later. For the purpose of this initial evaluation, we'll just look at purchasing. They also generally increase your natural gas usage. That's because cogens and fuel cells typically have a lower heat efficiency than a boiler. So if you're using a boiler to generate heat for your site, it'll give you about an 80% to 85% efficiency, where a cogen might be closer to 50 to 60% heat efficiency. So to get the same amount of heat out of a cogen, you need more natural gas than you would for a boiler. And so that increases your natural gas usage. And because your natural gas usage is increased, your natural gas costs almost certainly increase as well. And that assumes also, for the purpose of this, that this won't make a change to your carbon tax status. Currently, if your gas usage is over 200,000 gigajoules, or if you have other emissions on site beyond gas, you can generally participate in the output-based pricing standard, and that provides tax credits. And that's a whole different item. But for the purpose of this, we'll just assume that the generator is not going to make an impact on your carbon tax status. And your natural gas costs will increase as well. So fuel cells and CHPs, because they operate for a long period of time, again, the 4,000 to over 8,000 hours a year, most of them have a recommended runtime of no less than 4,000 hours a year in terms of cost payback. That's really the minimum you'd be looking at. Because they're running so often, they have significantly higher maintenance costs than a gas generator or a standby generator or solution. And for fuel cells especially, they have a significantly higher maintenance cost than a cogen because they have stack degradation over the lifespan. So the stack cells that actually create the power degrade over the course of their life. They need to be replaced every 5 to 10 years, and most maintenance schedules recommend budgeting maintenance costs ahead of time to pay for that maintenance when required. So from this perspective, you might think, well, why wouldn't I just buy a standby generator or even a battery? You know, the battery doesn't have the same natural gas usage, doesn't have the same natural gas costs, and it's really got the same kind of lower upfront costs that a standby generator has, and the same, if not lower, maintenance costs than generators. The payback, so for the different projects, depends really on what utility rate you're on. And again, this is what we were talking about with the Class A versus Class B. So for Class A customers, you get pretty much the same payback across the board, whether you're using a fuel cell, CHP, standby generator, or battery to reduce your usage. If you reduce 1 megawatt during the 5 peaks, regardless of what you use, it'll generate the same utility payback. For fuel cells and CHPs, they also get HOEP savings because they're reducing usage significantly during the long hours they're operating. Standby generators aren't really reducing HOEP or HOEP that much, and battery storage can reduce the HOEP, but it will have a small impact because for especially Class A customers, the HOEP is a fairly small portion of the bill. For Class B customers, the global fuel cells and CHPs will have a big impact on savings because they provide they reduce electricity usage, and because Class B is billed across the usage. For standby generators, they won't have a significant impact, and for battery storage, it won't have any impact because they're looking at because the battery has to charge from the grid and because then discharge into the grid, so there's no net change in usage, and that's how the Class B global adjustment is built. So for fuel cells and CHPs, they'll have a big impact on billing demand. They will reduce usage pretty significantly and across the board. So across most hours, you'll generally see a reduction, a step change down in load shape, and that'll pull billing demand down. Standby generators and batteries, because they operate less frequently and because they aren't used to offset a large chunk of load, will generally shave the peak demand. And by billing demand, we mean the monthly billing demand. So the bill you get on your average electricity bill for your peak use that month. So they can be used to shave that, but they won't reduce it the same way that the cogen or fuel cell will typically. And this is again in a typical application. And note that in this case, we're assuming that there aren't any capacity charges for behind-the-meter generation. This option does exist. It varies from utility to utility. And what the capacity charge is generally, distribution companies need to have the equipment in place to support your full load. as long as that load is grid connected. So they're putting in this large piece of equipment to support you, but they aren't recovering the costs if your billing demand is being reduced by this behind-the-meter generation. So they're putting in these charges to basically net out the effect of that, or offset at least part of the effect of that behind-the-meter generation on your billing demand. So that's what we're talking about with capacity charge, and the OEB has recommended that most utilities implement capacity charges because of the spread of behind-the-meter generation, and because that's leaving utilities with stranded costs that are being paid by other customers. They've basically said that's unfair, and they've recommended that instead of going from monthly service charges and just demand charges to a monthly service charge, a demand charge, and a capacity reserve charge to account for the size of the transformer, the size of the equipment on the site needed to handle the full load should it come online. And that's what we've actually seen in other jurisdictions like Alberta. They have a similar system where you pay part of your demand based on what you've actually used and part of it on what's actually available to you to use, regardless of whether you use it or not. Going back a slide, the other option or source of revenue for generators is demand response. Standby generators are generally very good for demand response because demand response in Ontario currently has a up to 4-hour window for participation, and standby generators can operate for that full 4-hour window. Now, batteries, they can get savings or revenue from demand response. It's generally less because most battery options we've seen presented to customers have a 2-hour battery lifespan or duration at their full power capacity, and so that's not long enough for the full demand response window. So they have to bid in less of their capacity to be able to cover that full 4-hour window. And fuel cells and CHPs, because they're running more or less continuously, they're already offsetting the load. They can't respond to the requirements for demand response. So they can't come online to offset load because they're already online. So they don't really generate much in the way of demand response revenue, any at all. So the summary from the cost side and the kind of operating profile side is that, fuel cells and gas engine CHPs have large initial investments. They generally have useful heat and power at a cost between 5 to 10 cents per kilowatt hour. That depends from CHP application, from fuel cell application. It depends on how much of the useful heat is actually being used versus what's being wasted, and it depends on the maintenance costs. So you could have on the low end with maintenance costs, gas costs, you're using the useful heat well, you could see a cost of about 5 cents. We've even seen someone with costs closer to 4 cents, but really most of them look on the 5-cent range for optimization. If you're looking at, say, a fuel cell that you're going to have to pay high maintenance costs in, and you aren't getting the same kind of efficiencies from the heat, you aren't using all the useful heat or making the most of it, you could be closer to the 10-cent range. Now that is still good cost savings compared to the Class B global adjustment, that 11 to 12 cents per kilowatt hour average market cost. If you're a Class A customer, it's just not worth it. You'll get the same savings for offsetting your load during the peak, but you're paying significantly more for marginal benefits. So with the standby generator, it's a lower cost investment than a cogen or a fuel cell. If you're a Class A customer, the savings you'll miss out on for the HOEP across the board will be generally more than offset by demand response revenue, and you'll generate the exact same global adjustment savings. So you'll have lower cost investment with pretty much the same savings across the board. And for a battery, they are generally slightly more than a standby generator, and generally significantly less than a cogen unit. But they provide large savings for Class A customers, although there is a risk with batteries that because they do have a limited capacity, they might miss a peak, although battery service providers generally suggest that their algorithms are good enough to ensure that you hit the peak. They are able to generate also partial demand response. So this is at first a high-level overview of the different generation types and the kind of applications that they tend to be best for in terms of the electricity side. So we'll open it up for questions, and we'll also be unmuting the lines so people can ask questions or send them in via the text chat. Okay. Okay, are there any questions out there? Okay, so then we'll move along to a look at the different ways of contracting these types of generation. So again, we already talked about purchasing. There are other options. There's lease option for different generation types, lease to own, virtual PPAs, and energy savings sharing. So the two we'll focus on are virtual PPAs and energy savings sharing as they compare to purchasing. Because those are the options we see presented most often to customers. So for CHPs and standby generators, we often see them, most customers are approached to just buy them outright. Although some standby generators are presented with the same kind of savings sharing agreement that you see in large part for batteries. Our customers have been approached to buy batteries, but for the most part, they tend to be approached with savings sharing agreements. And what a savings sharing agreement is where the battery supplier installs a battery on your site, but they retain ownership, and they will operate the battery, providing your site with power to reduce your costs. Then they calculate what your costs would have been without their actions, and you pay them a fixed percentage, previously agreed upon percentage. We've seen typically 50% of that savings calculation. So it theoretically lowers your cost and provides them with a steady revenue source. Most savings sharing agreements we've seen have a 10-year contract, and they're typically presented as being no risk options, although we here at 360 Energy have a slightly different view of that. For fuel cells especially, we've seen customers approached with the idea of a virtual PPA. Similar to a savings agreement, the fuel cell operator or owner would install the fuel cell on site, but retain ownership of it, and they would operate it. But rather than any kind of savings agreement, there would be an agreement to buy power from the fuel cell at a fixed cost. So more of a contract for the electricity from that fuel cell rather than an agreement to split savings. Some of them, rather than a fixed cost, will say a fixed cost below the grid cost. Again, this is also presented as a no-risk option for customers, and again, we don't believe in no-risk options. Now, just one note when it comes to purchasing, fuel cells and CHPs qualify for the federal government's accelerated capital cost allowance rates, which allow you to depreciate them over a shorter period of time for tax benefits. So this is, when we talk about things being no risk versus the risk, this is what we're talking about. So for cogens and fuel cells, the big thing everyone looks at is the payback when you're looking at purchasing. And for a lot of these, the payback will depend on whether you're a Class A or Class B customer. And that's the primary concern most customers seem to have with purchasing. For us, there are risks that will affect that payback. You can see any changes to the cost of fuel, any changes to the usage, either on the electricity side or the heat side at the site, will affect the payback. The changes to the carbon tax and how they affect your carbon tax status will affect the payback sometimes, and we have it as a risk, but sometimes that can be a benefit if it allows you to access carbon tax credits through the cogen or the fuel cell. Any changes in the utility rates. The big one we're looking at is capacity charges as a change to the utility rates. If you put in this behind-the-meter generation expecting to have so much in demand savings, and then you're being billed for that regardless, it'll impact the payback. Any kind of changes in the grid costs that you're competing against. If we get an industrial rate from at a lower cost than what you would be paying to generate yourself, for example, you might not have as much of a payback as you previously budgeted for. And any changes in maintenance, either the maintenance requirements or the costs of maintenance for the generators. So that's all associated with purchasing and, to some extent, leasing and leasing to own. For virtual PPAs, our big concerns are who pays for the CHP fuel, because the generator or the fuel cell needs fuel, and there needs to be the infrastructure in place for that. And if they're using your infrastructure, how will that affect your natural gas rates? How are you going to determine what was used by the CHP and what was not? And if you're putting in utility infrastructure specifically for the fuel cell, it'll drive the cost of the installation up because the utility has to charge for that new infrastructure. Right, I'm just getting told to pause for a moment.
Technical difficulty.
Okay, can everybody hear me now? I'll open it up, the mic's up, just if someone could confirm that again, you can hear me. Are we having any technical difficulties with the audio?
Okay.
Good. Okay, so we'll just carry on then. So again, who pays for the fuel for it? Who pays for the utility studies to get it installed, both for the electricity grid and the natural gas grid? Those costs need to be considered, and they need to know who will pay for them. If you're doing a comparison to grid costs, say 1 cent or 2 cents below the grid costs, how are those grid costs calculated? If they're relevant, you need to know what you're signing on to and how the costs for you that you'll be paying are calculated, and who pays for maintenance stack replacement. That one we've typically seen, especially relevant for fuel cells, tends to be included in part of the operating cost offered by the supplier, so that it's not passed along beyond in the cost rate. The big risks with those are change in utility rates, especially if you're basing your contract on what you would have paid otherwise or what grid costs. If the utility rate structure changes, you need to know how that'll impact your costs. And especially if you get capacity charges, you might have this behind the meter generation, and you might see your grid costs actually increase in terms of capacity charges that weren't included in the initial PPA calculations. So that's for cogen and fuel cells. And really the bottom line here is know all of the included costs, regardless of the option you're looking at, know what all of the costs are, and know who will pay them and how much they could be, because that'll impact what the payback will be on these projects. And you don't want to get any surprises where you expect they're going to pay for something and they expect you're going to pay for something, and now you have an issue. The same goes for standby generators or batteries. Again, these are generally installed for Class A purposes. The big changes that you're looking at, or big risks you're looking at for buying a generator, is changes to the ICI program. That's really why most people we know or most customers are putting in generators or batteries, and they're looking at optimizing revenue for or optimizing savings through the ICI program. And again, as we mentioned, that's currently under review from the provincial government. They directly asked a question about how customers in Ontario feel about the ICI program. Our view is that they'll probably get a lot of different responses on that from people either profiting from it or missing out on the opportunity. The other big impact on paybacks will be what happens if you miss a peak. And that, because if you're counting on saving $500,000 to $550,000 and you miss 2 peaks, your savings have now dropped to closer to $300,000, and that's still good savings, but it changes the payback period pretty significantly. And again, we see that as being more of a risk with batteries because of their capacity life rather than generators, although that may depend on how accurate the algorithms are or the operating plans are for batteries. Other big changes, the changes to the capacity charges could have an impact here. It depends on how much you use them for billing demand shaving. Usage changes, declines in the global adjustment cost. The IESO is forecasting that costs will decline over at least the next 6 years for the global adjustment, due in large part to nuclear refurbishment, higher power prices in the HOAP. So how does the payback change if the global adjustment costs decline? Where you have a 1 megawatt generator in place, but your average peak usage is only 750 kilowatts, you might save all of the savings when you do hit that 1 megawatt peak, but you might also leave savings on the table because it's more because your load at that point would be below the 1 megawatt anyways. For savings sharing, the big things customers need to know is how savings are calculated. We've seen a number of these savings sharing agreements that assume that if the battery was operating at peak, that it was operating at peak capacity. So that if your usage, again, this ties into oversizing, if your usage would be below the maximum battery capacity, you're being credited with more savings than you actually achieved, and you're paying them more based on those inflated savings. And the other big issue is what happens in case of technical difficulties. Who's responsible for that? What will that do to your insurance? Not listed on there specifically, but if you've got a battery, what kind of risks are you taking on for that battery? And what kind of technical issues could you face, and who deals with those? And then what happens if rates change, if the ICI program does disappear, or if capacity charges come in and you can't get the same kind of billing demand savings? Who pays for that? How does that impact savings calculations? Again, that's stuff you need to know upfront. And again, with the risks, there are the risks of missed peaks, especially since you aren't operating it yourself, somebody else is operating it for you. And there is the issue of capacity charges that you might be stuck paying while they're crediting you with savings on your billing demand. So again, the bottom line, and we'll say this again, know all of the included costs, who will pay for them, and what they will/could be. You don't want any surprises when you're looking at these options. And if you can think of a cost that's not mentioned, like utility studies or global adjustment, demand response, you see something that's not included in the proposal, know to ask to make sure that you know who's paying for it. because you don't want to get stuck with unexpected costs. So that's a bit of a high-level look at the different options for installing these distributed energy resources. We've kind of summarized it. This is my general when I approach an energy resource supplier proposal. These are the things I look at to do, and the things I'll look at to watch out for. So the things to do is to take control of the process. Don't wait to be approached. To get the best option for you, you need to know how you use energy, how you pay for energy, what your options are for on-site generation, and then take all of that information and figure out what the best option is for you. You know, identify cost drivers in terms of either usage, like when you use energy the most, in terms of when you're billed for energy the most, ideally both of those things together, and then use that to determine what option is best for you out of these resources or out of any resource we haven't mentioned. And then take control of the process, send out RFPs, generate competition, down the cost, so that you're getting the best option for you, not taking the first option that's pushed towards you. And then once you get proposals, from your RFP, evaluate those options impartially. Take a look at the suppliers, what they're saying, evaluate their proposals, their savings estimates, and be conservative with savings estimates in terms of how things could change rather than just what they're telling you things will do, and evaluate those options impartially. And then speak to your utilities. We've had customers install generation only to find out that there isn't the electricity system capacity to support them, or the natural gas capacity to support the generation, or that they're being stuck with different studies that they have to pay for that weren't considered. So you want to know what all of the costs and all of the risks are from your utility side before you make any commitments. And then also get a third-party legal review or a third-party opinion on these options, because it's a very complicated industry, and people will tell you what they know or what they want you to know, and knowing where your risks are from that perspective is important. And there are others out there who can help you look for things that might be missed. So that's the list of things to do. A nice handy to-do list for the long weekend. So for to watch out for, watch out if you've already been presented for a proposal. Watch out for optimistic assumptions or calculations. We've seen a number of suppliers present savings calculations. They assume a 2% escalator in the global adjustment, or they assume a 3% escalator in the global adjustment. And what we've seen from the IESO and what the big risk is that the global adjustment will decline by somewhere from 2 to 5% for the next 5 to 6 years. So if you're counting on savings being 8 or 9%, 10% higher, and savings and the costs are actually 8 or 9 or 10% lower, what will that do for your payback? It'll change it. So you need to watch out for anything that just optimistically assumes that the savings are going to increase. This ties in also to the savings calculations. Anything that optimistically assumes that you're maximizing your savings in the face of what you're actually getting, generally works against you, because they're pumping up their own tires and their own revenue from you at the expense of your pocketbook. A lot of that ties into incorrect or outdated historical data or missing costs. So make sure that you know that they're basing their decisions on as accurate data and as real data as possible, rather than anything that's based on historical data or assumptions about energy usage that don't necessarily reflect the reality of your site. On that topic, know what potential changes are happening at the site and how they'll impact your costs before you install this generation. that if you're going to be reducing your ICI peak and you don't want to go in and oversize any equipment based on the current usage when you're using, or if your usage is increasing, you don't want to, you want to know that before you're putting in this equipment. Again, look for missing costs, anything that you know will have to be paid or that could have to be paid in the installation process and getting things set up, or in terms of rates, that's not been addressed in the proposal. They might have plans for that and they might plan to pay for it, but you want to know that. You want to know what all the costs are going to be and who is going to pay for them before you make any commitments, because you don't want to get stuck with added costs you weren't budgeting on. Look out for waste or oversizing. So if your average peak load is 500, 600, 700 kilowatts, and by peak load I mean coincident peak is 500, 600, 700 kilowatts, and they're putting in a 1 megawatt, you're not going to get all of the savings from that 1 megawatt generator. You're only going to get savings for your average peak load, that 500, 600, 700 kilowatts. And again, that ties into inflated savings estimates. And it's just wasteful. It'll impact, you'll have a lower payback than budgeted because you've got this oversized equipment in. Make sure that you know who's billing who, how billing's going to be done, how costs are going to be calculated, how bills are going to be passed, and make sure you have access to all of the data in terms of how things, especially for energy savings agreements, how things are going to be operated, and who's responsible for the operation and who's responsible for the data from that, and then make sure that you can get the data to ensure things are being done as you were told. And then look out for the potential changes. So make sure they have a plan in place for what happens if ICI disappears, or if the OEB adds capacity charges, or at least know that you can talk to them about it and that they have a solution in place and that you aren't carrying any risk from those items. So that's our webinar. We'll open it up again for questions. We'll open up the lines. I see we have at least one question from the chat.
Okay, so the question we've got is the 5-10 cents you quoted, is that a blended electricity cost or is that commodity only? That's the first question we've got, and I'll let James answer that.
So the 5 to 10 cents is the commodity, the cost for the power from the cogen or the fuel cell, rather than the global adjustment cost.
Okay. So we've got another question here. So is there any information on the term arbitrage mentioned in the potential battery saving options?
So for arbitrage, for batteries, we're looking at charging the battery during low-cost hours, typically when power costs in Ontario are negative, which is typically the overnight or weekend period, and then discharging during higher cost hours. So that can generally get you revenue of about say $10 to $20 per megawatt hour, based on the typical variances from off-peak to on-peak pricing. Assuming you're optimizing it, you might be able to get up a little bit more, but again, that's still fairly modest in terms of the total savings associated with the project.
Okay, I'm going to try unmuting everybody again. We've had some technical difficulties to do with this. Regardless, if we can't unmute anybody, and if anybody does have any pressing questions that they're not having answered today, I mentioned at the very beginning we're going to be sending out a quick survey just to kind of get everybody's input on how today's presentation went. There is actually a place in that survey just for any further questions, and we can absolutely get that back to you. More quick question that we've just gotten. So comment first, interesting regarding the fuel cells and CHP. Is it worth it installing and operating without the heat recovery part? I'll let James get to that as well.
Yeah, the heat recovery is a large part of what, one, provides benefits for CHP fuel cells, and it's what enables you to get the capital cost allowance rates or expedited capital cost allowance rates from the federal government, and generally it's the gas portion is if it's used and sized correctly, the gas portion and heat recovery portion is what makes it economical. Gas prices, especially in Ontario, are expensive enough that a generator just running for the most part will be for most hours out of the year at a disadvantage compared to the hourly market and compared to the utility rates you're paying. The heat tends to make it economical, assuming you're using most, if not all, of the useful heat from it. And that is also the part of the associated benefit with carbon tax as well.
Okay. I think the last. Okay. So we've just got a user that has excess heat on site and no use for the steam or hot water. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So without any further ado, I'm going to let everybody go for today. But as I mentioned, if anybody does have any questions, or if anybody does, importantly as well, need any assistance with this process, I mean, we did cover a lot today. But as I kind of mentioned at the beginning, I know everybody's situation, everybody's got different operating requirements that will make things, you know, obviously fairly individual as far as what option does work for you. So please do feel free to reach out to us, and it's something that we do already for customers and do help with. And like I said, with that survey, that will also give you a bit of an option for reaching out to us as well. Without any further ado, thank you guys so much for attending today. I apologize if we did have some minor issues just there with sound quality. As I mentioned, getting this online, and we should have pretty good sound quality once we get that online as well. So thanks again, everybody, and we look forward to speaking to you all soon.